Hey, before we get started with the show, we want to let you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Audible.com.
That's right. They have more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They're the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comics-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, and David Haydu's The 10-Cent Plague.
Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and get started today. This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with I.N.J. Culbard.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the interview show, we're going to be talking with I.N.J. Culbard about his latest book, The King in Yellow, as well as some of the other stuff that he's come out with over the past several years. But before we get to that interview, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that their discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes 50% off, but many times the discounts can get more impressive than that.
Yes, and in the spirit of our interview with I.N.J. Culbard that you're about to listen to, if you go to Discount Comic Book Service now, you can find his collaboration with Dan Abnett from Boom Studios' Wild's End. The first volume is available in paperback for 50% off from DCB Service, so that's $9.99. And the first issue of the second volume, Wild's End Enemy Within, number 1, is also 50% off for $1.99. So you can get a couple of the most recent works by the artist that we are going to be talking to today.
Exactly. And another great thing about DCB Service is they provide a wonderful and cost-effective entry point into many of the authors and titles that we discuss. So if you're not familiar with the work of I.N.J. Culbard, this is a great place to start by going to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your books there, including Culbard's, be sure to drop them a line and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, we have a really nice conversation with Ian, and he covered a lot of ground, not only about The King in Yellow, but about his work as a whole, particularly his adaptation work.
Yeah, that's right. And so we have a lot of fun and get into some really interesting discussions about the idea of adaptation and the philosophy that goes into doing an adaptation.
Yeah, well, let's get to that interview then.
Yes.
We're happy to have on the Comics Alternative I.N.J. Culbard. He is the adapter and artist, most recently, of The King in Yellow, which just came out from SelfMadeHero. Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So maybe start off by asking, you've done a lot of adaptation work, right? You've adapted quite a number of narratives from H.P. Lovecraft. You've done the Sherlock Holmes stuff. What brought you to Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow?
Well, it was around about, we'd just done Charles Dexter Ward, which is the second Lovecraft adaptation that I did. And it was then that I actually pitched to SelfMade, and I'd mentioned that there was this King in Yellow that I wouldn't mind doing, and I talked about it briefly. But at the time, nobody, it was one of those ones where basically if you knew your Lovecraft, you knew Chambers and you knew The King in Yellow, but otherwise the readership beyond that wouldn't really know what it was. And so it wasn't until the TV show True Detective came along and happened to mention it quite a bit that then suddenly everybody knew what it was. So that made me pitching it incredibly easy straight after that. We kind of jumped back to that pitch and just went, well, let's just do this then. So it was, that's how it came about. I was aware of it because of reading Lovecraft. So it was one of those ones where after doing Charles Dexter Ward, I kind of wanted to expand out and do other bits that are kind of related to the mythos and Lovecraft and see what else I could do. And because I do these adaptations, I never take for granted that I might actually be doing another one. So I pitch like anybody else does. So I try to make the pitches interesting and choices a bit more interesting. And so, yeah, that's how that came about.
So you wanted to do this before True Detective, the first one?
Yeah. Yeah, quite, yeah. Because I was really... yeah, I mean, it's like I was saying, I was just trying to find something after having done 2 Lovecraft books. And, I'd only just done the second one, wasn't really sure how they would take for people, and just wanted to try anything, within that nobody else had adapted yet. And so, yeah, I really wanted to jump on that quite a while ago. So it was great.
So you could say you were into it before everybody else was into it.
Well, no. It's Lovecraft fans go, everybody would have known what that is. Yeah. But yeah, in a way, I had a pitch ready. if that's what you mean. And the minute that show hit and everybody picked up on that, I think Amazon started producing the book on Kindle for nothing, so people could just pick it up,
right,
read it, and that's, So at that point, I was able to say, well, we're pitch ready, we're ready to go. So it made it incredibly easy at that point.
Were there any specific challenges that this adaptation faced that maybe other adaptations you've done didn't have?
I've always got, one of the things I always struggle with is the liberties that I take with the original text that I originally do. And it's funny because I always think of it as, like with this one, I probably took the biggest liberty, but also at the same time was the most faithful to the book in a way. And I am with all of them. It's just that I retell the story. I've always had this thing since I did Mountains of Madness with the first one. I just looked at adaptation, and I didn't want to do it in that way that classics were done with, like caption boxes and large, they kind of almost, I didn't want to make it like it was a York Notes version of the original book. I didn't want it to be an abridged version either. I wanted it to be a book in its own right. And cinema does that when it adapts things. It kind of veers off the text, it deviates and does its own thing and finds the thing that it's trying to talk about. So a director will, a movie maker or a writer will look at what they're actually adapting and just say, this is how it speaks to me, and I'm going to tell the story like this. And so that's what I wanted to do with Mountains. That's what I did with Charles Dexter Ward. And of course, when I get to this, it was, I had right from the word go, I had this view of it being like one big story, not several different stories. Mm-hmm. Because the original book is 10 short pieces, but only 4 of them, these ones specifically, have anything to do with the King in Yellow. The rest of them are very, they're Paris sketches and there's poems and things like that. So, but they're not very specifically linked to the King in Yellow, whereas these 4 are. And on further reading of them, there was a through line in there that I could latch onto and actually tell the story in the way that I've told it and bring all these bits together. And And that's through the character Jack, who pops up in the book, who in the original was in the Yellow Sign, and then kind of has a sort of cameo in The Mask, and kind of inadvertently by mentioning Hildred, he kind of is part of Hildred's world as well. So there is a link with that character all the way through the original. And so I just cemented that by bringing all the pieces together. They still work as separate chapters, these short stories, but they're essentially also one whole thing. And so, so the challenge is taking it and telling it as a book in its own right. So that if somebody picks up a graphic novel, this is the graphic novel version, in the same way as this is the movie version or the TV show version. So I just wanted to approach it that way. And that can sometimes, with each one, they each present their own challenges doing it that way.
That actually, you brought up then what I wanted to talk about a little bit with this book, which is some of the liberties or, kind of additions and subtractions that went into this adaptation. And one of the things that struck me when I read it is that when I had originally, and this may get to a challenge of, say, adapting something to comics that's in prose. When I originally read the story The King in Yellow, I always wondered, for example, how much is going on in Hildred's imagination.
Yeah.
And specifically the crown he wears and the robes he puts on in his room. In the book, I always felt there was some ambiguity as to what that really was, because his cousin Louis comes in and says something about, a biscuit box, right? And so, is this like a cheap brass, crown that he's put in this biscuit box, or is it really a crown that's in a safe? Were there issues with kind of that kind of ambiguity that you saw? The
line is still in there with the biscuit box. Because I wanted it to be that, like, you're seeing it as Hildred sees it.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as Hildred is concerned, all this stuff is real, and you're seeing it from his perspective. But you can also extend that narrative to the other stories as well, because you could say that of what happens to Alec in the Mask when he comes back in the marble room. That scene, you could say that that's a similar sort of a thing. I'm being really. I don't know how much I can spill about that without spoiling it, but it's a bit. But with this bit, I left that in because I wanted that element of, well, this is clearly this, and this is just up here. This is up in his head, or because you're looking at it, which one are you actually seeing? It's the unreliable narrator that you're dealing with in this, and so you can show them something, and at the same time you're hearing something else. This actually comes up in an episode of True Detective, and it's the bit where they're having the shootout, but they're actually giving a different account to the police. Well, that's the unreliable narrator.
Right.
They're doing exactly that in that episode, because what you see on screen is the real events. That's what actually happened. What they're telling the police is something entirely different.
I want to explore this further, the point of view, the perspective, because I've always thought that when it comes to first-person narration, that's, for me, for comics creators, it just strikes me as one of the biggest challenges. How do you represent that in a way, not exactly like prose, but fiction, but in ways that can be just as effective? And I think it's more difficult for those in comics to do that. In case in point is back to this very first story in your book, and also in the original King in Yellow, The Repairer of Reputations. Now, this story is one of the four that in the original, it's one of the two, I think, of the four in the original that you adapt, that we have a first-person point of view reporting on what had happened. And when I was first reading your adaptation of The Repairer of Reputations, it struck me not so much as a first-person point of view as maybe more of something a little more limited in focalization, or maybe something almost omniscient, to a point. Third person, if nothing else. And I thought that because of the way that this story, your adaptation, begins and ends. We have 3 pages which sets the stage of the, I guess this world, what changes have been wrought, and now we have this chamber that has just been opened, the lethal chamber, and everybody's there to kind of open the chamber for business, so to speak. And then the very last page of your adaptation, we get, and I guess this is Jack talking with the doctor about what had happened. So those are 2 sections of the story that are outside of Hildred's perspective. So we know that he's not there. So that's why I thought that this was more of a third person. But going back through it, every single part of this story, though, outside of that very beginning and very end, he's a part of this. And so it's as if we do see things through his eyes. And maybe this is a long way for me to set up my question. But what did you feel was the most difficult part in trying to tell certain stories, like the Repairer of Reputations, from a first person point of view?
Can you grab that last bit of the question?
Yeah,
because one of the things is I'm trying to do this in a way that actually discusses the whole thing. Because to me, it's not just the point where he's there's a little bit of that whole David Lynch thing of over-explaining something that's kind of surreal, because there's several different meanings you can attribute to something, and you don't want to steer everybody down the same path, because that might not universally be true to everyone. And so he tends to not answer questions. Whereas you have at the beginning, for me, right from the outset, you've got that it's Hildred's perspective. The world that we open the book in is clearly not the New York that we know of that period of time, because we have this narrative over the top of it that says such and such happened. And, consequently, we have this opening of these suicide chambers. And then it goes off into Hildred's world, where we're already in Hildred's world when we start. But what we learn by the end of that chapter, when we get to Jack at the end, we learn the reality of it is that that's not necessarily the case. All of that stuff that went before might be part of Hildred's psychosis. But at the same time, what you also have is later on in the story, you have this moment where, this is the thing, is that whether or not any of this is actually real, as in all the stories, and whether these 3 guys that actually shared an apartment in Paris on the Rue de Dragon in Paris, back as art college students, whether they ever left that state at one point, because he wakes up in the bedroom with the book on his chest and the Court of the Dragon. And he's back where he was before. He's back in the old days, which is before Hildred goes nuts, before all this other stuff goes crazy. It's not specifically and implicitly, it's not sort of, made very, very clear at that point, because it could be that avenue that you go down. Or it could be that stuff hasn't happened at all. Or it could be that it has happened, and the book is driving you crazy, because there's this presumption that he read the book before he went to sleep. And then all of this stuff, the minute you've read the book, you get this crazy imaginings. So that Alec and the second one, Boris, when he's read it, it's the thing that drives them out of their minds. And by this point, Jack's already read it. And this thing's happened to all his friends, and hence what happens to Jack. So I kind of see it from that way.
Okay. So, because that actually leads me to the other question I had for you, or another question.
Spoiled.
Yeah, no, I don't think we're spoiling. But one thing you do is you invert the last 2 stories that you adapt, the Yellow Sign and In the Court of the Dragon. And at first, I was wondering why. I mean, I could come up with suppositions, but by inverting those, you're able to do, I guess, kind of underscore what you just described.
Yeah. So that basically you end the book where it would have, in actual fact, there was one point when I was talking to the editor about this, and I said, I've got a copy of this book where the order is different. And whereas the copy I'm working from, the order's the way that you normally see it. So the order of the chapters. And I was saying, but the way that it makes more sense, because the narrator at the end in that last story, which was the third story in most readings. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In the Court of the Dragon, which is usually the third, and then you go on to Yellow Sign. But the thing is, that guy in that story is the narrator that you don't have a name for him or anything about him. Okay, and so, but that could be Jack, because the guy ends up in church, and there is a line in it that talks about Jack and the crucifix that he gives to Tessie. Mm. And that's right. A tenuous link, but that's actually an original book. But that is the kind of tenuous link that I will string things together to make a coherent mass. So that I look at things like that and I go, but that does make sense, because in the original book, he actually gives her the cross. Why would he give her the cross? What's the relevance of this when the only other character who actually goes to church is in that story, which is the last one, the way that I put it, but the third one in the original lineup of stories. And since in the original, those stories linearly don't correspond to each other anyway, it didn't make, it didn't seem to be a problem to be able to put that to the end and end on that crescendo of having us actually go to Carcosa. Because it was an odd place to put it, to have it as the fourth thing and then jump to the next one. But in a book of 10 stories, that doesn't really matter. But in a book of 4 stories where they're very much linked, that then you're readdressing the order of how they come. If that makes sense.
Oh, it does, because if the Yellow Sign had come last,
yeah,
I mean, I'm sure you could rework things to add some cohesiveness, but the way that things are represented, it would have seemed a little off.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the order works. I wonder if we jumped too quickly into the book, and now I feel like if somebody's listening and they don't know what The King in Yellow is, we're getting into some of the minutia, but
until it's something like I'm just checking here, it's like 50 pages before you realize that that might not actually be true what you've just read.
And the concept of The King in Yellow is that in this world, which is set in what, 1920, 25?
No, it's 1895 is when the actual story's set. But the King in the Repair of Reputations is set in a fictional 1925, as perceived by a writer who was writing in 1895.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so the King in Yellow is itself as a scandalous play that has been published in this world and has been banned because it causes people to go insane. At some point, once they get into the second act, right? The first act seems to be okay. Mm-hmm. And then they get into the second act and they go mad. So when you're saying that one of the possibilities in reading this book is that reading the play itself triggers the weirdness that happens to these people.
Yeah. So it's the bit of the story where, that's the part that Tess reads when he's looking for her in the apartment. Mm-hmm. Right. And he finds her, and she's basically opened the book up and started reading. And she's straight into that part of it, which is the bit that drives you crazy.
I'm always fascinated with that idea of works of art or books that can do that. Yeah.
It's like Gloomy Tuesday or whatever that song is, the one that drives you, was meant to, the Hungarian song that's supposed to drive people to suicide. Or it's like The Ring, where the video cassette is being handed around and you watch it and 5 days later you die. It's that sort of the way that kind of meme-like transference of the horror. I quite like those.
One of my favorite characters in the book, and I think one that I really like what you do with, is Mr. Wilde in The Repair of Reputations. Yeah. Who is such I find one of my favorite horror characters in general. It's this guy with this, his ears don't stay on his head, and he's little, and this cat is constantly attacking him. And I thought you did a great job with adapting that character for this.
Thank you. Well, the funny thing with him was that, like, when I'd drawn him, he originally had eyebrows, and I went through erasing all the eyebrows when I'd realized that everybody else is kind of a bit weird looking as well. I had to make it even more extraordinary, because he is quite odd looking in the book. They make an emphasis on how odd he is in the book, and I just didn't feel like he stood out enough. But the moment, so I'd drawn him with all the expression with the eyebrows, but the moment I'd removed them, I didn't change anything else about the face, and it was quite interesting, because at that point I realized there's something else going on with that performance of that character, if you see what I mean. And yeah, I quite enjoyed doing that one. So there were bits about him that were, not intentional, but they kind of came out of accident by the very last minute. It was at the very last minute when I had done all the color work on it, and I looked at it and just thought, there's something about this guy is not quite working. So I went back in and just rubbed out all the eyebrows.
Huh.
Well, even the characters that are supposed to be, quote unquote, sane, like, for instance, Dr. Archer, which in the story, we only hear about Archer. We never see him represented, but you do illustrate him. I mean, he looks almost as creepy as Wilde does.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he needed to, I needed to be able to show that he existed in both terms. So I needed to show that he existed in Hildred's head and looking just the same way as when you meet Jack. So there's almost that sort of like, Wizard of Oz element of those characters having some sort of real life counterpart, so that when they wake up out of the dream, you say, "Oh, well, that's based on an actual person."
And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to look for even more links between or among these stories than I had originally thought. Wasn't it at the opening of the Lethal Chamber in the very first story? Wasn't the statue of the Fates?
Yes.
On the outside, and then that is what Boris is working on, and then ends up using himself.
Yeah, that's
as
a book as well.
Yes,
it's actually there as well. Yeah, and then there were certain little things that were very much like there were echoes of each other going on. So you had even though the Arc de Triomphe and the Washington Arch.
Right, yeah.
A different size. They are almost the way that they were described in the book. They kept making this pinpoint reference, and it just to me felt like they were portals between each world. There was the existence of that time. That's how you get from one place to the other. They've got this sort of geographical, then architectural sort of echo of each other, and they are. I mean, the Washington one is actually based on the Triumph, and I believe yes, it is. And then. So there were little things like that. So, but the Fates, yeah, they are actually referenced in the book as being that's one of the key things that ties Boris and Jack together to Hildred.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were talking earlier about the need, or at least you kept thinking that you may need to be true to the original or not deviate too far. Of the 4 short stories in The King in Yellow that you adapted for your own book, which do you feel that you took the most liberties in adapting?
I think that possibly the last one. I don't know. I feel like the whole thing, because of having to make it work as a one-piece structure, I felt was the biggest step that I was taking with it, because I'm not doing all of the short stories because they're not relevant to King in Yellow. So that was partly that, and it's almost broadly every single one of them. But I suppose actually naming the character in the last one, showing the character as Jack in the Court of the Dragon. That was one where I felt like it was a big step, but it was necessary because, as I was explaining before, for it to actually make that kind of sense. And it also explains what happens to Jack at the end of that story, because in the story he falls, and there's this, that is the natural progression of what would actually happen to him in that instance. It's almost like the whole sequence is an afterlife, is somebody slipping away. And so, an out-of-body experience almost. And so that was one. But I'd done that before. I did that with Charles Dexter Ward because I showed who 118 was. And 118 was a character that was referenced but you didn't see. But because of the way that the book was put together, it made perfect sense that it was who it turns out to be in the story. And yet, if I really looked at who 118 was, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of Lovecraft's stories, then it would be someone entirely different. But for the purposes of that narrative, for the purposes of that book itself, then it matches perfectly to that character. And it needs to work in that way. I mean, the thing is that I have is 2 golden rules, which is basically stick to the spirit of the thing that you're adapting, but also work within but you're also adapting this to a comic. So you use those kind of rules effectively to adapt to. So you're using visual story, visual exposition and things like that. You've got this to play with now, so use those elements. So at certain points it's like you were saying with the Dr. Archer, you don't see him in the book. There's no point where he's actually met. He's just spoken about. But in this is an opportunity to show him, because I would be showing him anyway in reference to that scene, because it was written about in the book. So there are certain points where those feel like you're probably taking greater liberties than you normally would do, but that is going back to actually, you're working within this medium where it's a visual one, so you're going to be showing these things quite naturally, and that kind of builds it up as a book in its own right again. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Before it babbled on and then completely gone off track.
No, you even got to a question that I wanted to ask you, if you had a philosophy of adaptation, since you've done so many, but you mentioned that you have a couple of, how did you put it, golden rules that you try to adhere to.
Yeah, there's just very simply, there's just 2. And it is just to do those 2 things, and then it's fine. And it's funny because, even things like picking up on mountains and where that starts in terms of the structure, monkeying around with that, and making, often with the Lovecraft books, creating my own framing devices for them. And that kind of, there's moments where I sit there and they're the things that I have the most second guesses about, because and then I do them and then nobody notices. And so I just sort of think, oh, okay, that's fine. I can get away with that. So I'll just keep doing that. That's all right. And really, I mean, it's hopefully it's justified, It's something the editor, Dan Lockwood, who was the editor of the volumes, the anthology volumes, we go over quite a bit. So I get him to call me out at any point if I've unnecessarily crowbarred something in. He'll go, no, that's not, So I'm always careful of that kind of thing. But it has to pay service to the story. It has to have a reason for being there.
I'm trying to remember. I don't have the quote at my fingertips, but something that Lovecraft said about Chambers was something about that. I'm really, really paraphrasing, but there's great ideas that end up often being frustrating because they're never followed through with. If that's not what specifically what Lovecraft said, but he said something about being frustrated often with Chambers because there's great imagination there and not much follow through. And I wonder if when I originally read the books or read the stories, I love the idea of the world that he creates. This this 1925 post-war with Germany. Yeah. The idyllic world, and yet none of the stories seem to be require that world. They could take place in 1895 just as well as this fictional 1925.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I had a question there, but if you found anything like that with one of the few things that seems to come back is the death chamber, but that we really only ever see that once.
Yeah,
get used. Were there things about the world, this future world that Chambers created that you wished had more kind of going on in the stories?
It's funny because the death chambers is basically Futurama, isn't it? Yeah, the suicide. Yeah. There was it had a very kind of it had very much a kind of the man who The Man in Woodbury Thursday, I think that's the book, and G.K. Chesterton book, had the very kind of like really eccentric characters all the way through it. Everybody felt eccentric. I mean, it's all coming out of Hildred's head as far as I'm concerned, but it's that sort of oddness about it. And I don't know. I liked the way that the stories would wrap up. I felt like he actually really, especially with the one I really liked the ending on was The Mask. He had a real kind of, I really liked the relationships between the three characters, the love triangle effectively going on between those three, and the way that kind of plays off each other. There's something very classic about that. I quite like that. With regard to what Lovecraft said, I don't know. I've adapted books that Lovecraft hated, so stuff. So it's like I tend to ignore what he felt about stuff. I've read his letters and things like that. I mean, he was so damning of himself as well that it's difficult to say. And he was always very tough on characterization of his own work and stuff like that. So it's funny because when you're adapting, you're working within the parameters of what is set down. Those are your goalposts. Those are your rules. Once you set that out, you're sort of working within the form of what you've got to work with. And so whatever he's provided, I work within the confines of that. And I then, like we were saying, I manufacture parts of it myself in order for it to work in a certain way. But those parameters, any writer kind of sets themselves when they're writing a story anyway. Even an original work. So they're working with set parameters as it is. So I tend to not look at it as, wouldn't it be great if we could do way more with this and just like set it 40 years in the future and show what happened after. A little bit of that creeps in, but not too much. I'm trying to stick as closely to the book as possible. So I tend to not worry about that, I think.
Maybe you wouldn't say this or admit to it, but I mean, there's a part of me that wonders if maybe you have done Chambers a service by making King in Yellow a little more cohesive. And what I mean by that is, you rightly do choose those first four stories. I mean, you change the order a little bit, as we discussed, but you take those first four stories that are in the original, obviously linked through, The King in Yellow, that fictional play that Andy mentioned earlier. And in addition to that, you have, I think, woven all four of those stories a little more closely, one to the other. And I think that the moving around or the switching of those last two stories just make a lot of sense. In other words, what you've done is you've taken what Lovecraft may have felt was a not completely successful collection of stories, and you've cut away some of it, you've rearranged others, and you have what I would call in your King in Yellow something that's akin to a short story cycle, or what I've called a graphic cycle. In other words, there are four distinct short stories that are all interlinked in very significant ways, and you can find the kind of small ways that they're connected one to the other, but then you can also read them as a whole as something completely different. So I think you've done what Chambers wasn't as successful in doing with those first four stories of his original book.
Oh, well, thank you. But I would say that I have the benefit of hindsight, which Chambers didn't have when he actually wrote the book. You see, I always see it as basically the adaptation is a draft. And so I've come at it with years of people writing fiction in a certain way now, to be able to tell a narrative that actually fits today. And to look at it in a different perspective. And so I've got the benefit of hindsight on my side in an enormous way. And I'm now thinking of going back. Charles Dexter Ward, for example, was incredible when reading that, because you have to consider that was a first and only draft of the book. And yet it's a book that spins a phenomenal number of plates. I mean, how he managed to get that down on paper, I had to take the thing apart before I put it back together. And it was a mess in here. I mean, it was quite extraordinary work to pull apart and put back together. And to think he actually just sat down and just wrote it is incredible. But I think But again, in that instance, I had the benefit of hindsight. I was effectively doing the second draft of that book. So what you're reading is effectively that, somebody coming into it with fresh eyes and going, okay, so maybe if we do this and we do this. So, there is that. But, that's something to bear in mind. I think, because adaptation to me is quite important. I think that we wouldn't have Beowulf if we didn't have adaptation. I think I was describing to somebody else that it's essentially like going from one campfire, hearing a story, and going to another one and telling the same story. And by the time you get there, you got your own little embellishments on it. But essentially, what it meant to you, you're telling other people. And so your spin on it is very much from somebody, your own perspective. The things that influence you, the little bits that you loved about it are going to have greater emphasis. And so that's all informed by many years later, somebody picking up that work and going, hey, there's a way of telling this story that's a bit more like this. So, yeah, if that answers your question, I think that would naturally happen and should naturally happen with any adaptation, because otherwise, it's a transcription if it's exactly the same thing. I'm not one of these people that thinks something should never be adapted, or obviously because I've done several adaptations. But I also, I don't think there's any merit to something that slavishly sticks to the original text, and won't budge from it. Maybe, but I just think that, there's an opportunity to be able to tell the story with your own experiences applied onto that. And there's often, there's sections in some of the Lovecraft books where I use personal experience and place that in there. And, so I feed off certain things just as a writer when I'm doing these adaptations. They're not just straight from the book and only from the book. There's elements of myself in there because of how I've reacted to it and also what it means to me. And if I've got to put in a scene, that shows some sort of dynamic between two characters, I'm going to use what I know. So, I ramble on and then I sort of think, answer the question.
No, that's a fascinating kind of philosophy of adaptation as more is it part interpretation, but more than interpretation, this idea of it being a new draft. Yeah. That you're building on somebody's previous work, as you said, with this kind of hindsight of having read other work that's been influenced by that work.
Because I always say to people when they've read stuff, what's nice is when you get people read the Lovecraft stuff and then they go, and then I've gone off and read the original works. I always think that's brilliant. I always encourage people not only to do that, but also read the original of the book that you've just read. I did that a lot with Mountains, for example. Because with Mountains, what that has is an extraordinary amount of travelogue details before it actually gets anywhere. And there's amazing stuff about hiking and skiing, right at the beginning of the book when they actually get to Mount Terror and, what that was like. And it's a different experience. You should definitely pick up the book. This is by no way a substitute for that work at all. But it is, like I'm going back to saying earlier, it should work within its own merits, that there's a reason for it to exist, and not as a shorthand to a different work in a different medium,
Now, you've done a lot of adaptations. We've talked about the Lovecraft, now the Chambers. You've done the Sherlock Holmes. You did a picture of Dorian Gray.
Actually, and Dorian Gray was I.N.J adapting, and I was the artist on that.
Well, your art. So whether you adapt or write, I mean, these are the kind of books, and what they all have in common, they're mysteries. Many of them have this macabre feel. So I'm assuming that the kind of things that you adapt, either visually or, you write and adapt from the original, would probably be those kind of narratives similar to this that you're drawn to. I mean, for instance, would you adapt Sense and Sensibility?
Possibly not. But I actually started out. We were doing the Holmes books together, and at one point Edgerton did Pride and Prejudice with another artist. And at that point, I thought, okay, well, I've got to come up with something because I've got this gap and I need to be able to do something. So I pitched. And what I pitched was Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. And the original thinking on that was, and I've written before, I used to write for television. I used to do development writing for people like BBC and Nickelodeon and places like that. And Aardman is another one. So I'd done writing before when I was an animation director. But what I wanted to do here was, my thinking was really naive at the beginning. I thought, I'll do Lost World. And I thought, I'll do Lost World because I'll be drawing dinosaurs effectively and jungles and stuff. That'll be great. So it'll be more like an art book. And I'll just do that. That's how I'll get my foot in the door doing some writing, and then I'll sneak some writing in on top of it. And that was impossible. But then in the last second, when that really wasn't taking, I just thought, I'll do mountains. Mountains is going to be easy because it's just snow. So that was literally my thinking. And I thought, and I like Lovecraft, so let's just do that one. And that was how I fell into that. And they turned around and happened to be working on the first anthology. And they said, yeah, that would be great to do this. And it was the quickest pitch ever. It was within about an hour. I managed to pitch that. And it's just because it was the right thing at the right time in the right place, and it all worked. And then when I got into my teeth into the actual adaptation of it, I found really how I really wanted to do things. It wasn't until I'd actually started working on it, I suddenly went, right, okay, this is how I want to do this. I get this now. And we'd done that with the Holmes books. We'd very much gone back to source, to text, and actually looked at Holmes, and Edgerton and I had talked about him as a real person and how he would be, because the Holmes in the books is in his 30s, whereas the guy that you see on TV is often in his 50s and his 60s. So he's not going to be running down the street after a carriage like Lethal Weapon or something. So we decided to go back to that and really make it like adventure books, that they're adventures. And we looked at it in a very real sense in that way. And so with that, armed with that kind of thinking, I was looking at the Lovecraft stuff and thinking of it in terms of, if this had been like a film made in the 1940s, or David Lean or somebody like this had actually made this movie, what would this actually have been like? And then thinking about what the scenes would actually be like, and the narrative, and if this guy was played by this actor, and what would that actually be like in those scenes? What's the motivation for those characters to make certain choices? Like in the original book, Dyer makes this choice about going into the mountains to explore, to see what happened because of Lake. But there's no real explanation of why he does it. Whereas what I gave him was this motivation, which was that Lake was obsessed with doing this, but Lake's dead now. And Dyer sees that his friend has died, even though he didn't agree with him and he argued with him. And suddenly he thinks, we're going to go up into the mountains. We're going to continue that seeking out something because Lake, that's what he wanted to do. We're going to do this. And then that gave him motivation that wasn't really in the book. And little things like that. And once I started finding little bits like this, it became like detective work. Finding sections in the text, like I was saying about tenuous links that just have to be very small strands. To me, are like bodies of evidence. I just sort of sit there and think, well, there was a reason for doing this, and this is it. And underline that part, and I sort of pull the whole thing together that way. And then I thought, God, this is a lot more fun than just drawing snow. So, yeah. So I ended up, yeah. And of course, drawing snow was not quite as easy as it would be.
But what you said about that motivation, I mean, that's also entirely consistent with things that often happen in Lovecraft, where the narrator is not always the person who made the original discovery. Yeah. It's someone who has found out somebody, another academic has made this discovery, gone mad, and now they're picking up where that person left off. So that kind of motivation is really consistent throughout Lovecraft's work.
Yeah. And and it's funny because he said that they didn't have characterization, but I was seeing so many things in between the lines of these characters it just made much more sense. It just, and the bits where you're able to just make stuff up and just put it in, nobody seems to notice. It's like the little things like Dyer and Danforth for looking at Mount Erebus in the book, and at that point he quotes a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, and the reason why I took that out was because I looked at Erebus and thought, this is about the dark corners of the earth. This is about chaos and all this. They're in the presence of primordial gods. And the moment I was writing that down, I just thought, yeah, because how true is that? Because later on in the book, they find out that's incredibly, they really are. And so little things like that got added in. And those dialogue sequences, they don't really happen because, like in Mountains, there's no dialogue in it. There's just one bit where there's a radio relay of somebody telling them what, the discoveries they've made. But there's no real sense, there's no real dialogue in it. So I had to make all of that up. But it was all done strictly by what was actually written down by Lovecraft. And it's that kind of piecing things together that became enormous fun to actually do. And I just thought, yeah, I could do this no end now. And, find books where they don't talk much. Adapt those and then give them things to say. But I mean, King in Yellow, the dialogue's used, more or less verbatim. I mean, there's one scene which wasn't. There's one where he meets a guy in the street who comes up asking for money. He's begging, and Hildred writes the yellow sign and gives him the yellow sign. Well, that's it. That is in the book, but the exchange between them isn't. Mm-hmm. It was where he asks him why he's out. Why'd you do this? Because I need to eat. Why'd you do that? Because I'll perish. And then he talks about, what is your purpose? And he doesn't understand what the question is. And then he gives him the sign and he said, this is your purpose. I give you purpose. I give you more than money. I give you purpose. And the day I see that as a quote attributed to Chambers, that's the day I know I've won. So I've managed to dupe everybody. But those little things where you get to do that kind of stuff, I quite like. Because I think all writers have that where when they're writing a book, they set out the parameters, what the book is about, the structure, the acts, what they're going to work within, and they hit between those parameters. They work structurally between those to figure out what they're doing. And with an adaptation, those parameters are there. You just got to use them.
Now, you mentioned a second ago when you were talking about Mountains, Edgar Allan Poe. Now, is he someone that you have any interest in adapting?
Possibly. I'm always wary because I do the dark and horrible books, and it leaves you a little bit down after you finish doing them. I do another one, and then you end up nihilistic after doing a couple of them. You kind of it's very bleak. So I tend to think I'm going to do a romance next, but I always end up coming back to those horror ones.
And I ask that for somewhat selfish reasons because, I'm a big fan of Poe adaptations, and the problem with you doing a Poe adaptation is there's so many out there. I think he has to be the one writer that has been adapted the fiction and poet, fiction writer and poet that has been adapted the most. So what are you going to do that's new? And what I would like for someone to do is to finally do an adaptation of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym.
Right.
I would love that.
Of course, because that's going back to Antarctica and stuff like that. Richard, I've got it right, isn't it? Richard Corbin.
Corbin, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much has that covered, I think. That's his patch. If I came to that, possibly, but I tend to think of more obscure ones when I tend to think about Ambrose Bierce and people like that. I tend to think of things like John Silence and what's the other one? Hodgson. And nobody's done Clark Ashton Smith. That's why I was hoping season 2 of Detective would start quoting Clark Ashton Smith. But it's tricky. I don't really think about it in that way. I've got 2 more Lovecraft books. I'm working on Innsmouth now. And then after that, I've got Dreams in the Witch House, both for next year. And So I only think so far ahead, I think. Doing Poe, though, would be interesting.
So those two other Lovecraft, you say, will be released next year?
One is in the spring and one's in the fall. So we've got the Innsmouth is in the spring, and then followed by Witch House. Dreams in the Witch House. And then I don't know if there's any more after that. I really don't. I said that after the first one, so they just kind of pop up. And, But in this instance, this is the first time where I've been commissioned to do two of them at the same time. So, And they've done one after the other. They're not done at the same time, I should say. But, and the Innsmouth one is proving quite interesting. Quite enjoying that one. And there are liberties taken in that one.
Now, what kind of challenge? We've been talking primarily about your adaptation work.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what kind of challenges did you face in your book Celeste that came out last year?
Oh, well, I was really ill when I did that book, so my health was the biggest challenge while I was actually making that book. Mm-hmm. I ended up in surgery 3 times that year. The medication did not help.
Wow! And there are 3 main characters in there, so
did everything.
Surgeries.
I have a rule of 3 thing that my publisher probably finds quite funny. I have this thing that I call the rule of 3, but the things happen in 3s only because you look for them. But I'm not that daft. But I think that was challenging in a very different sense, and also setting parameters. I didn't want to do I didn't want to do a regular book. I didn't want to do a book that was. I also felt like people weren't really. I'd read a review somewhere, and it was kind of somebody else's book. It's often other people's reviews and it kind of struck me that they weren't really looking at the artwork in the book to tell them the story. So I very much set out to tell a story that had a visual exposition going on as much as, dialogue and stuff like that. So that's kind of where that came from. And it's also from dealing with various weird issues when I was making it. Like I say, I was in hospital about 3 times, and it was 3 times over the course of it. That kind of hampered the production of it because it was meant to take about 6 months, and it took 9 in the end. And and the difficulties were. The first one was the very obvious one was that there's 3 narratives at the same time. I very much like stories in which there are, aside from horror and everything else, the kind of stories that I really like are the ones where there's several different characters, different storylines in different locations. I tend to like that kind of thing. And all working towards some sort of goal. And in the instance of Celeste, there were 3 stories, and they were essentially, from my perspective, they were stories of the mind, the body, and the soul. And I had, when I was doing those, it was figuring out how to intercut the narrative of each one. And so what I actually did to begin with, I had actually started writing it as you read it, and I couldn't write it the way that you read it. I had to go away and actually write the 3 separate stories and then cut them together and then rework them. And it wasn't until I did that, I kind of, it was the draft process where I was looking at it and thinking, I'm essentially adapting the previous thing that I've done, and it's that sort of thing. And that was the challenge, was really making them work as separate stories, entirely different places, different times even, and actually click at the same beats within their stories. That was tricky. But I kind of refer that as my difficult 3rd album, doing it first. I had an opportunity to do something, and I just thought, okay, I'll do something that I really want to, not worry about. I don't know. I suppose it's quite a surreal piece. Some people get it, some people don't. But I revert back to the David Lynch clause of not explaining too many things. Also, at the same time, what was interesting was the editor read it a certain way, and a person working over at SelfMade also read it in a different way entirely to what was actually intended. So I thought that was quite interesting. And so they were picking up on visual clues and things like that and making different kind of sense of it. And I thought that was pretty interesting in terms of people's interpretation, because everybody will have a different type of interpretation. I can remember reading something on the author's reactions to their reviews in terms of what a critique had said, what they intended, and they wrote down in response was, nope, I never meant to do that. So I thought that was quite interesting, because the way that you come at something and you're writing it will be entirely different to what somebody else has read. The interpretations of what the petal is at the beginning of the story is quite interesting. I can tell you right off, it's a cherry blossom. And cherry blossom is very easy to quickly wiki up and see what the significance is, and it'll tell you everything. But a lot of people sort of read into it in a certain way, which is quite curious, because they read into it in really weird, surreal ways that I hadn't actually expected. So yeah, it's one of those kind of stories.
Well, if have you ever seen that the documentary about Kubrick's The Shining? Was it Room 237?
I've seen half of that.
I think if you once you see that, I feel like people have interpretations available to them that creators could not even imagine.
There was something, is that the one where they're talking about what the different, so they're looking at things like the tubs of food or something in the storage cupboard, or the paint or something like that, and they're talking about an Indian reservation, Native American reservation.
The movie's about something like the massacre of the Native Americans.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And there's other ones as well. There's other interpretations of it. Like that completely, you're looking at it thinking, no, that's not, that wasn't what I intended at all. But then you as a viewer will have your completely unique interpretation of something.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and that's kind of interesting. Mm. That's the golden rule of not actually doing stuff that everybody is going to, trying to please everybody is not what you should set out to do. Just make sure that you're happy with what you've done, primarily. And then maybe, hopefully, other people will read it, and those things that really resonate with you. That's the same with the adaptations. Those things that will resonate with you will resonate across the board to other people and so forth.
Now, your work in 2000 AD, you have a series that you're currently underway with, again, another adaptation, or another work with Edgington. Yeah. We have the first volume of Brass Sun that is out, but you have other things going on with, or soon to be going on with 2000 AD.
Yeah, with Dan Abnett. We've got a series called Brink, which has been described as True Detective in Space, and I don't know how much about it I can tell you. It's set on a space station, and it's a horror, procedural as well. It's it's a horror in the sense that it's quite unsettling from the get-go. And that's about all I can actually probably say about it.
Did this project come about after your work with Abnett on Wild's End?
Oh, yeah. We did, the very first time we worked together was on New Dead Audience, and we had, and Abnett came up with he had the whole thing premise-wise locked in place, but then we had a conversation about the world of it, and the real world building of New Dead Audience came about from this conversation. It was enormous. We had a very long telephone conversation, and it was off the back of working that way. We were kind of riffing off similar sorts of things, and just when he actually came to visit, he saw that my bookshelf was pretty much the same as his. So the influences and the inspirations to things were very similar. So we were coming at it in the same way, and so we talked quite a bit about doing, developing more stuff. And so all our conversations tend to be very world-buildy kind of conversations for ideas. We did have a marathon of a session of discussions about what we could do next. And after about 3 hours, we had 5 projects. And we've slowly started to see those come about. So you got Wild's End, you had Dark Ages through Dark Horse, and now Brink. And I'm trying to think what else to because there are a couple of others in the pipeline that are coming about. So all those ones from that initial conversation are coming to be. And we've since then had conversations that have extended out to a boatload of other ideas. We've got quite a few now that come, have started to come about.
So do you usually find yourself working with particular individuals that you've worked with before and you really spark with, like, for instance, with Edgington, with the Sherlock Holmes, and then Brass Sun, and then Abnett, the new Dead Guardians, Wild's End, and this new project? I mean, do you find yourself sticking, so to speak, close to home in that way?
It's usually on my part. I mean, they can work with loads of different artists. I can only work with so many writers. Mm-hmm. So, and also because of the fact that I'm trying to do my own projects as well, like adaptations and coming up with my own stuff. I mean, I recently did a Future Shock for 2000 AD, which I'd written and drawn. And so doing stuff like that. And I also did a 3 thriller with Eddie Robertson a while back, earlier this year. And so there's a little bit of branching out there, but it tends to be because, I mean, especially with Dan and working with Edgington on Brass Sun, which is a long going series. I mean, we've got this one, there'll probably be a next one, and so forth. That's a continual feed of stuff to work on. I can only do so many things. Especially as I complicate things by writing stuff myself. I mean, it just makes it time consuming. And I mean, the time it takes for the person to write the story, but then compared to the person drawing it, it's considerable investment, it's of time. And I really chime with those writers. It tends to be really good to be able to, there tend to be writers that listen to your thoughts and stuff and, work with what you're working, how you'd like to do stuff, and back and forth. Communication's key, I think. I've heard about situations where you get writers that don't even communicate with the artist. I find that quite incredible. I don't think that would ever happen. If I ever got a writer that didn't want to talk, I'd doorstop them. So they actually had a conversation. But I think it tends to be that I kind of go back to the same people because we've just got tons of stuff going on. I mean, like a 3-hour conversation ended up being 5 projects that we're slowly working our way through. Dan and I is going to take a while, I mean, Dark Ages was 4 issues, things like that. So it can take time on my part.
So it sounds like you've got years of projects that we're gonna be seeing coming out. Yeah, bit by bit. There's quite a few with Dan, I've got to say. I've got Brass Sun with Edgington. Brass Sun Edgington works quite a lot with Disraeli, and, just kind of fallen that way. I've got the Lovecraft book still coming along, and Wild's End is now in its 2nd series. So, nicely keeping quietly busy and ticking along, if that makes sense.
So there's a lot of I.N.J. Culbard for listeners to look forward to in the very near future.
Yes, there is. And always towards Christmas, it seems. That's when, by the time I've actually got everything done and everything starts coming out at the same time. I mean, last year I was on shelves almost every week of the month. So this year, not as bad. But, there is quite a lot coming along at the moment.
Well, Ian, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us, not only about The King in Yellow, but your other upcoming projects that we're going to be seeing soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I found that a really interesting conversation. We talk about adaptation on this show a lot, and so I'm always interested in hearing from creators what kind of philosophy they take into the art of adaptation. And Ian Culbard gave us some really interesting insights.
Yeah, and in fact, one thing he said, and he said this a few times, he has the benefit of hindsight when it comes to the works that he adapts. That made a lot of sense. And I mean, I enjoyed our conversation specifically about The King in Yellow, but I very much appreciated his larger philosophy of adaptation. Because I found it made a lot of sense. It was coherent. This is something that when I interviewed not quite 2 years ago, Richard Corbin for our blog, and was asking him about his philosophy of adaptation. You know, he does have one, but I don't think he went into near as much detail as Ian did when we were talking with him. He definitely has a direction where he's wanting to go and things that he wants to do. I didn't say this during the interview, but you know, he praised Richard Corbin when it came to his adaptations of Poe, and I think rightly so. But I think what Corbin is to Poe, Culbard is to Lovecraft.
Yeah, I think that's true, especially as in terms of not just doing solid adaptations, but also marking out that territory.
Oh, exactly. So we had a wonderful time talking with Culbard, and if you're not familiar with The King in Yellow, the original book by Robert W. Chambers, I don't know, Andy, would you recommend that someone read Culbard's adaptation first and then read the original, or vice versa?
I'm not sure. My experience was to read the stories first and then the adaptation, but that's because the adaptation didn't exist at the point when I read the stories. Now, I have only ever read the first 4 stories in The King in Yellow. Anyway, I didn't read the ones that weren't part of the actual King in Yellow mythology. So, that, you know, anything beyond those first stories I can't answer about either. So, but you know, I think it's a great introduction to Chambers' collection. Maybe an entryway would be Culbard's book, which I said this in the interview, but I do see this as a really nice graphic cycle. Yes. Yeah. So if you want to find out more about Culbard's work, then you can pre-order it, such as Andy said at the top of the show, through our sponsor, and that's Discount Comic Book Service. Right now, you can get for 50% off the first volume of Wild's End, as well as the very first issue of the new Wild's End series. And if you go to the website of the sister company of DCB Service, In Stock Trades, their website, instocktrades.com, you can find other books illustrated by Culbard. Great stuff. For instance, you can find the trade of Dark Ages that he did with Dan Abnett at 50% or 42% off of the cover price. So instead of paying $14.99, you only pay $8.69. And you can find Brass Sun that we had discussed during the interview. He has illustrated. Ian Edgington did the writing. That is at 25% off. So instead of paying $25, you'd pay only $18.75. So whether you use DCB Service or In Stock Trades, you can't go wrong. It's a great way to begin building your I.N.J. Culbard library. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find in the right-hand side of the browser is a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can leave us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple. Or you can contact us over the telephone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2 guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to our blog. You can check out the Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. And we also have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please be sure to leave us a rating and review. You can also find us on Stitcher. You can give us a review there as well. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and our essays that are related to comics, on our blog, which is at comicsalternative.com.
So all the ways to get a hold of us and find out what we're doing.
That's right, and we do enjoy hearing from you. Until then, though, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.